I think in the coming years and decades, anyone who benefits from the current financial system, the US dollar financial system with stocks, real estate, bonds, is going to blame Bitcoin for that old system's collapse. And in this video, I want to explain to you what exactly I mean by this. Let's get started. The current financial system is entirely reliant on debt, and eventually, the people who are taking on too much debt make mistakes and they mismanage what they have, and they eventually put themselves in a position that they can't recover from. And this is called a debt spiral. So what a debt spiral is when a country has so much debt, or an individual, any entity has so much debt that they can no longer service the payments. So they have to borrow more money to service the payments on their debt that they already have. So we can see here on this chart from 1990 all the way to 2023, the US national debt has just continuously gone up. If we take a look at the US debt clock, we can see what the expenses are of the US government. So in total, the US federal tax revenue is about $4 trillion, $4.9 trillion. Revenue per citizen is $14,645. The total US national debt is at $35.4 trillion. That's trillion with a T. Right now, the US government is spending most of its money on Medicare and Medicaid, Social Security, defense and war, and the interest on the debt. If you really think about it, none of these expenses are productive. I would say sometimes politicians may tell you that defense and war is productive because it ensures that the US has certain agreements, then they continue to be upheld. Other than this, I don't think these expenses are very productive because if you think about it, Medicare and Medicaid is going to help to extend the lives of people. I'm not saying that we shouldn't work towards extending the lives of people, but it's not really productive because the people who are getting Medicare and Medicaid are very likely in retirement already. So the US government shouldn't be borrowing money to sustain this expense. Same with Social Security. This is people who have retired, who have had their 30, 40-year careers, and now in retirement, they're being supported by this Social Security budget. So they're getting a payment every single month or every 2 weeks, and they're able to spend this money on their day-to-day expenses. Defense and war, of course, you know exactly what that is. But the interest on the debt is what really stands out to me. So the interest on the debt is the amount of money that they're having to pay to service the debt that they already have. So they have this $35 trillion worth of debt. They're paying $1 trillion, almost $1 trillion on interest alone. You can see here the US federal spending in total is about $7 trillion every single year. So far this year, every single year the US government has been in a deficit. I'll show you more details on this, but so far this year, the US government is in a $2 trillion deficit. So they're spending $2 trillion more than they're earning in tax revenues. So you can see that right here. I saw this picture that really explains what a debt spiral is. A debt spiral is essentially where a country or a company or an individual takes on so much debt that to service that debt or to pay the interest on the debt, which is the cost of borrowing money, they have to borrow even more money. So we can see here, you spend more than you earn. The US has been doing this for decades. You borrow to fill the gap. This is exactly where this $35 trillion worth of debt came from. More of your income goes to repay debt and interest on the debt, and you keep spiraling worse and worse. You keep borrowing to maintain your lifestyle. Great stress equals more debt, disaster. And there's a couple of quotes down here. Rather go to bed supperless than rise in debt, from Ben Franklin. Once you get into debt, it's hell to get out. Don't let credit card debt carry over. You can't get ahead paying 18% interest. Charlie Munger. And if we go back to the debt clock, we can also see here that the US government is in debt for 123.45% of its GDP. The GDP is the gross domestic product. That's the value that's being created within the US. So if the US doesn't increase this GDP significantly, they don't find ways to produce more goods and services, if they don't maybe have AI as become the hub for AI, or maybe even for Bitcoin, I don't think this is going to decrease, because the amount of interest that they're paying on this debt is pushing this number up on its own. And most of the expenses that they're spending on, like I said, aren't productive. They're not supporting small businesses. They're not supporting the average family to take the risks of starting a business. What they're doing is they're just spending more and more money to protect the interests of a class of people who have already retired, who are already retiring in the next few years, and probably won't be the ones starting businesses. And what they're doing is this debt is actually representative of the futures of people who haven't even been born yet. So children who aren't born yet are the ones who are going to be paying back this debt. So I just Googled US debt spiral to see what exactly Google says. It shows here that US public debt is at its highest level ever in peacetime, $34.62 trillion. So this is a little old. It's at about 35.4 trillion. And there's no sign it will decline if current trends persist. That means that the US government probably won't be able to get out of this debt ever. They won't be able to pay off this debt because if they want to, they're going to have to borrow more money to pay it off. And again, that's another spiral that's just getting worse and worse. Annual interest payments on the US public debt are more than $1 trillion. So they're paying $1 trillion a year in interest alone. The US national debt is growing by $1 trillion every 100 days and roughly $3.6 trillion per year. This was in July 15th, 2024. I want to show you a perfect example of compounding in action. So I'm going to switch over to a spreadsheet, and if you need to lower your brightness, do it now. I brought some data over from Investopedia to look into what exactly the debt is coming from. And we can see here the year of the debt, we can see the balance of the debt, we can see the increase in debt, and we can see any major events that were maybe triggered by the presidential team at the time. So we can see here in 1929, the total debt was $17 billion. Right now it's $34 trillion. 1929. So 1930, the U.S. dropped its debt by $1 billion to $16 billion. 1931 back up by 1, and we can just go through this. We can see the numbers go from single digits to then double digits, and then back to single digits for a little while, and then back to double digits. And now double digits have become normal. Double digits, they're in every year. Every single year has double digits of increases in the debt, in the dollar amount of debt. So after a little while, of course, it gets worse and worse and worse. Reagan tax cut, Reagan increased spending. I'm not trying to call out Reagan specifically. I mean, this is something that compounds over time. We can see how much worse and worse it gets. So we can see the numbers. There were different parties that were elected every 4 years, and we can see here the number just keeps going up. It went from $90 billion in increases to $144 billion in increases. The debt was increased by $1.017 trillion from 2007 to 2008. And numbers just get normal. So we can never go back. We can go from 4 digits, so we can go from quadruple digits to triple digits, but we're never going to go back to double digits. We're never going to go back to billions of dollars. We're going to probably stay in the $1 trillion range at this point. So like I said, if you zoom out and you look at the chart, this is what the increase in the debt looked like. So the increase in the debt just keeps increasing. The amount that it's increasing by is accelerating. That's the scary part here. That's what Bitcoiners are trying to show you. People will tell you that Bitcoiners are benefiting from this. They want this to happen. They are the reason for this. But we can see here, this started before Bitcoin even existed. We can see here, Bitcoin was introduced or discovered and released to the public in 2009. That was one of the worst years for the US government's debt increase. And the reason for that, there was a bailout. The companies that were messing around from 2001 to 2009 with debt, they were lending billions of dollars to people. Lehman Brothers was a company that was basically gambling. They were borrowing money and they were gambling, and then everybody who lent to them was in trouble. So the US government had to bail out the entire financial industry to make sure that the Ponzi scheme keeps going. Bitcoin was introduced here as a result of this broken financial system, as a result of things already spiraling out of control. So we can see if we look at the chart, it doesn't happen overnight. We were already at the $1 trillion level in increases per year by 2009. And like we can look at the numbers. It's just going to keep going up. We can see here in 2020, $4 trillion of spending from 2019 to 2020. $4 trillion worth of spending. Then from 2020 to 2021, $1.4 trillion of spending. These numbers aren't going to come down because these numbers consist of all of the payments that I showed you. This is just the deficit. So this is the amount that's increasing by. So no matter what, pretty much every single year, the US government is going to increase its debt. It's not going to decrease it. It's just going to keep increasing. And what will happen to the interest rates that it has to pay? What will happen to the amount of interest that it'll have to pay over time? So we can actually create another spreadsheet, just a very simple spreadsheet here. Right now, the total debt is $35.4 trillion at a 1% interest rate, and we're probably not going to go back to paying 1% on treasuries for a very long time. But at a 1% interest rate, the amount of interest that the U.S. government is paying on its debt is $354 billion per year. At a 2% interest rate, it's up to $708 billion. 3%, it's at $1.062 billion or $1.062 trillion. 4%, it's at $1.4 trillion. 5%, it's at $1.77 trillion. And these numbers are just going to keep increasing. They're going to keep going up because that's just the nature of the situation. If somebody can borrow as much money as they want to, and they can do whatever they want to fulfill the demands of their voters, then they will, because their paycheck relies on it. And this number will keep increasing until the US can no longer handle to pay off its interest, and until the rest of the world rejects US dollars and US treasuries as a form of money. So what Bitcoiners are doing here is they're trying to tell you that this is where the world is going. If you have your assets tied up in real estate, in stocks, you have no way out. You're locked in this system, and there's nothing that you can do to leave it. There's no amount of wealth that you can take out of this system and move to another system if this system were to go bankrupt. So it's like if we were playing a game of Monopoly, and you are playing with a banker that can constantly keep replenishing their own wallet, no matter what, and everybody knows, and they can keep paying the rent, and they can keep buying whichever properties they want to until everybody else goes bankrupt. So the goal here is to concentrate the wealth with a very small group of people, in a way, bankers, large investors, and keep them holding those assets for as long as possible so that everybody else is, in a way, stuck in debt slavery. So if we think about it, there are people who own hundreds of houses, people who own thousands of houses, people who even own tens of houses. These people are going to continuously get wealthier and wealthier in this US dollar financial system until nobody wants to use US dollars anymore. And people start moving to other parts of the world, and they start realizing that these other parts are better to live in than the US, because the US costs keep going up. It keeps getting more and more expensive to live there. So what's going to happen is productivity in the US is going to decrease. The GDP is going to decrease. And the network of people who want to use the US dollar, who are forced essentially to use the US dollar to pay their taxes, will decrease, and it'll keep decreasing until, I think the rest of the world is probably going to figure it out before the US, but it'll keep decreasing until nobody wants to use US dollars anymore. And we're already seeing this. People are getting rid of their US dollars to buy stocks, to buy real estate. They don't want to hold US dollars because they know for a fact that the US dollar will continue to lose value over time. This is the Fed funds effective rate. This is basically the cheapest rate that anyone can borrow US dollars. This is essentially the overnight bank-to-bank lending rate. What the Federal Reserve does is it increases this interest rate to decrease inflation. It then decreases this interest rate to increase inflation. So if the economy slows down for whatever reason, if prices start coming down, the Federal Reserve starts decreasing interest rates to get people to borrow money. So the reason why this is tied into all of this is because the Federal Reserve is now in a very difficult spot. If the Federal Reserve starts to increase interest rates, they're going to trigger even bigger interest expenses for the US national debt. So the US government is going to have to pay more and more interest to just maintain its debt. If the Federal Reserve decreases interest rates, inflation is going to go up because more people are incentivized to borrow money and just buy whatever they can. So if the Federal Reserve increases interest rates, it slows down the economy, it increases the debt of the US government, so the US government has to pay more and more in interest. But if it decreases interest rates, inflation goes up, other people start borrowing money. So right now, the Federal Reserve is in a very, very difficult position. Either they choose to let the US dollar die. In a way, I think that's probably where things are going regardless, because if interest rates go up, the Federal Reserve has to lend more money to the US government, the US government has to borrow more money and add it to the economy. If the Federal Reserve decreases interest rates, again, other people are going to borrow money, so more money is going to be entering the economy regardless. So in this case, the Federal Reserve has started decreasing interest rates. So what we're going to see in the next year, 2 years, 5 years, is inflation is going to get a lot worse. We're going to see this number at some point. We're going to see this number probably reach 70, 80 trillion dollars. The only way for the US government to survive this would probably be to increase tax rates. And how would they do this? They would probably tax people who are running businesses. They would probably tax people who own real estate. Maybe people maybe charge a higher property tax. Maybe they'll charge unrealized capital gains to people who own all of these legacy assets that are held by institutions in the middle. So let's say stocks, they're held by all these financial industry companies. We have banks, we have brokerages. They're all held by these institutions. And what the US government can do, because they're held by these institutions, is the US government can lock people's accounts and stop them from selling or stop them from cashing out unless they pay a massive tax, and a massive unrealized capital gains tax. And nobody knows when this could happen. Nobody knows if this could happen. I don't know if it happened. I think the game theory here is that if the US government doesn't do something like this, it's probably going to collapse anyways. The dollar is going to collapse anyways. The global financial system is going to collapse anyways. So I think the best way to go, just seeing the research, figuring out how to get out of this system, how to basically escape this system. I think the best way to go is to own Bitcoin, because Bitcoin is a completely separate system. And I think even companies, countries, and other individuals are seeing this already. There are a very small group of people who see this, a very small group of people who spoke about this years and even over a decade ago. They were already mentioning that this is a problem. So if we look at the mempool and we look at block, the very first block that was created, I'm going to switch over to a tab. If we go to the very first block that was created, we can see there was an inscription on this block. If we zoom in, we can see Chancellor on brink of second bailout for banks. We're now going to be heading for a third, fourth, fifth, sixth, 10th bailout for banks. And who's going to pay for this? Taxpayers. People who are going to pay for this are the people who are actually productive, the people who aren't gambling, the people who have savings. If you have your money in a bank account, your bank can be bailed in. So anyone who deposits their money in that bank account, their money can be used to make sure that the bank continues to survive. And this is the system that we're in. This is the system that has been built over the last few decades. And this is the reason for why Satoshi Nakamoto, either a group of people, an individual, whoever it was, created Bitcoin. So Bitcoin is the way out of the system. It's the only escape. It's the only way to protect your wealth in a system that's designed to take it all from you. And you might be wondering something else. Why don't we just wipe the debt and wipe the slate clean, let the US government continue and promise that they won't go into further debt? The reason why this can't happen is because the US government doesn't owe all of this debt to the Federal Reserve, doesn't owe all of this debt to an entity that it controls. It owes this debt to other countries and individuals. We can see here Social Security. The fund that's meant to pay for your expenses in the future is all invested in US treasuries. It's all invested in either short, medium, or long-term US government debt. As the amount of US government debt increases, basic supply and demand, the value of each individual debt decreases because nobody can create value out of thin air. They can't just produce something and press a button and just create something of value. That's impossible. The only way to do this is to extract wealth from everybody else who owns whatever you're producing. So in this case, as the US government prints up more debt and it adds it to the economy, it essentially devalues all of the other debt that's held by players in the economy right now. The public holds over $24.53 trillion of the national debt. This is from January 2023, so the number is very likely increased. Foreign governments hold a large portion of the public debt, while the rest is owned by US banks and investors. The Federal Reserve, the state and local governments, mutual funds, pension funds, insurance companies, and holders of savings bonds. So what happens if all of this debt is wiped and the US government gets to start again with a blank slate? Would you find it fair if you lent someone money and they said, I can't pay you back, so we're just going to start fresh, we'll just start over again, all my debts have been cleared, and there's going to be no punishment for me, so I don't have to deal with the consequences of my actions? Would you find that fair? I personally wouldn't. Keep in mind, other countries own this debt. So let's say China. China owns something like $1 trillion worth of US national debt. Japan owns something like $1 trillion of US national debt as well. What this means is the US government owes these other countries. They owe these countries money, they owe these countries value, and however they pay them back is between the two countries. So the only way for the US government to really get out of this is to print more money. For some reason, all these other countries are still accepting and they're still buying US national debt because they think it'll have value tomorrow. But I mean, it doesn't really make any sense to me because we know for a fact that more treasuries can be created, basic supply and demand. As supply increases, demand is fulfilled and prices drop. So the US government can continuously create more treasuries no matter what. It'll keep doing so. It'll keep borrowing because its expenses are just going to keep expanding. It's going to spend more and more money. So to me, it doesn't make any sense why these countries are even buying US national debt right now, but who knows how long they'll keep doing it for. If at some point they either sell their debt, the debt that they hold, and they buy another asset, the only other asset that really comes to mind in this case would be gold or Bitcoin. Gold is, you can't really use it as money. You can hold on to it, but Bitcoin is a much better asset if somebody wants to use it for savings for the long term, in my opinion, because the inflation rate is lower. The amount of Bitcoin that can be produced is limited to 21 million, and we have no idea how much gold exists or how much gold can be produced in the future. So to these countries, if they're playing the game the right way, if they're trying to figure out where the world is going, I think Bitcoin is the best way to go. And again, this is something that Bitcoin advocates have been talking about for a very, very long time. Nation state adoption is coming, and the US government just continuously spending more and more and more, the US government being in a debt spiral, is going to trigger this. It's going to give other countries a reason to look at a different way of savings. So if you've figured this out already, if you figured it out a while ago, congrats, you're extremely early. If you're figuring this out now, I think you have a limited amount of time to really get ahead of the crowd and get ahead of institutions. All the financial institutions, all the governments, all the banks are coming for this. All the banks are going to own Bitcoin, and you can own a small piece before they really figure it out. The people who don't figure this out are probably in for a very, very difficult time. I think over the next decade, over the next 20 years, the prices of everything else is going to decrease. So these people are going to see the real value, not the nominal value. The dollar value can keep going up, but they're going to see the real value of their real estate, of their stocks, of their bonds decrease significantly. They're going to be able to buy fewer and fewer things with those assets because the value is being accumulated in Bitcoin. So what I think will happen over the next decade, over the next 2 decades, is more and more countries, more and more individuals are going to figure out how Bitcoin works. And it's game theory. Game theory is predicting what your opponents are going to do and make a move before them so that you can benefit from their moves. So what's the best move in this situation? It's to buy Bitcoin. It's to support the Bitcoin network. And in the next decade, I think more and more people are going to figure it out. I think we're going to see an S-curve adoption. If you've never seen an S-curve adoption chart before, I think this is a great example. So we can see here, number of adopters and time. This works for pretty much every technology, every business, every way of learning. Over time, you get better, and then at some point you reach maturity. So in this case, we are probably somewhere around here, maybe even close to here for Bitcoin. I think the next decade could be this phase 2 right here, where we see exponential growth. We see increased growth that outpaces everything that's already happened. Eventually, we're going to be in the third phase where all the laggards, all the people who are slow to adopt Bitcoin are going to be the ones buying. So I think right now we could be somewhere here. I think most people will ignore Bitcoin until $1 million or more, and that's probably where we see right in the middle. And then after that, you'll see exponential growth. Eventually, Bitcoin will take over everything. It'll take over all fiat currencies. All monetary value will be put into Bitcoin. Any value that you have, let's say, for example, you have a house, you're going to purely base the value of that house on its utility. So the value of living in that house, the value of having the security that comes with owning a house. That's what you're going to attribute to your house. The monetary value of that house is going to be transferred from the house to Bitcoin because investors are no longer going to want to buy houses to save for the future. This is something that people have predicted for years, even decades before Bitcoin existed. People knew that the US government was going to go into a debt spiral because of the way that it was spending money and because of the way that it continuously spends money on things that are not productive. The US government is constantly making promises that it can't fulfill. It's going to keep making promises that it can't fulfill, and it's going to spend more and more money to make sure that people think that these promises are being fulfilled. For the US government, there's another benefit where if more and more money is being printed, the value of whatever they owe is decreasing. The real value of whatever they owe is decreasing because the value of the dollar is decreasing. And I want to just end this video with one last quote from Matt Hogan. A quote from my recent talk at the Barron's Top 100 Summit. A lot of people look at this chart and think, if I could invest in this chart, I would go all in. Well, you can invest in it with Bitcoin. So we can take a look at what the chart is. This chart just keeps going up. Bitcoin is the ultimate insurance policy against our government royally messing up the US dollar, taking on too much debt, and debasing the currency. It is, as Paul Tudor Jones says, the fastest horse in the race. So when politicians tell you over the next decade, over the next 20, 30 years, that Bitcoin is to blame for the US dollar's collapse, make sure you look at this video. Make sure you watch this video. Maybe you share this video with those politicians so that they can see that these predictions have been happening for a very long time. People knew already about this maybe a decade ago. People knew about this more than a decade ago. Now, more and more people are figuring it out, and now the damage is accelerating. This debt is going to spiral out of control, and it's going to continue to increase until the US government is taking on hundreds of trillions of dollars of debt every single year. The best thing that you can do right now is study Bitcoin, share it with your friends and family, and make sure that you're not caught in the crossfire when everything does finally collapse.